If you're a man who has spent 35 years working in banking and you think that experience makes you immune to being financially manipulated, let me be very clear with you. It doesn't. It makes you slightly worse. Because the kind of confidence that 3.5 decades in financial services builds is exactly the kind of confidence that a well-constructed emotional context can completely neutralize. You stop running the checks because you've decided, somewhere in your gut, that you can read a situation. And the situation you cannot read is always the one you've already decided you understand. My name is Edgar. I'm 67 years old. I'm back in Melbourne, and I paid Sin Sod, the traditional Thai bride price, twice, to the same family, for the same woman. Across 2 separate ceremonies, separated by 4 months, both of which I attended and participated in and stood up in front of a village of 300 people for. Both of which felt, in the moment, entirely legitimate, entirely beautiful, and entirely real. The combined total, converted from baht at the exchange rates that applied at the time, AUD $280,000. That's more than I paid for my first home. Gone. Into the pockets of a family in Udon Thani province that had been running this particular operation, as I eventually discovered, for the better part of a decade. Here's the thing that still gets me, though. The ceremony itself, the first one, the one that actually meant something before I understood what it was genuinely one of the most beautiful things I have ever attended. That's the part that's hardest to carry. Not the money, the beauty of the thing they used to take it. I retired in 2021 at 65, after 35 years with ANZ Bank in Melbourne, the last 12 as a senior relationship manager for corporate clients. You understand what that means in practical terms. I spent over a decade managing the financial affairs of companies worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I reviewed contracts. I assessed risk. I understood with professional precision the ways that sophisticated actors could construct a transaction to appear to be something it was not. I was considered good at this. I was considered very good at this, which is why the bank kept me in the role for 12 years, rather than cycling me through to something more senior and less technical. I also spent 35 years building what is, by any fair measure, a comfortable retirement. The superannuation was substantial. The investment portfolio was diversified. The house in Kew was paid off and valued, when I sold it after the divorce from Sandra in 2018, at a figure that produced my portion of the equity at approximately AUD $625,000. My son Nathan was in his 30s and settled, and I had reached the point in a financial career where the relationship between money and time was clearer than it had ever been, and the calculation I made was that I had enough of the former to do something genuinely different with the latter. Thailand came into my awareness through Greg, an old university friend who had retired to Udon Thani 4 years earlier, specifically to the community of Australian and New Zealand expats who had settled in the area. Udon Thani is the second city of the Isan region, the northeast plateau of Thailand, and it has a well-established expat population, drawn by the low cost of living, the warmth of the climate, and the particular lifestyle that a Western retirement income can buy in provincial Thailand, in ways that it simply cannot buy in Melbourne or Auckland. Greg had bought a house near the Nong Project Park in Udon Thani City for the equivalent of about AUD $80,000. He had a pool. His monthly outgoings were a fraction of what mine had been in Kew. He called me approximately twice a year and spent most of each call describing, in the careful, understated way of someone who doesn't want to oversell something he genuinely likes, what his daily life looked like. After the divorce, those calls started landing differently. I landed at Udon Thani International Airport in March 2022 with a return ticket for 6 weeks and an arrangement to stay with Greg while I worked out what the longer-term picture might look like. Udon Thani is not Bangkok. It's not a tourist city. It's not picturesque in the way that the international travel magazines describe Thailand, and it doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is, a functioning provincial Thai city of about 400,000 people, where the rhythms of daily life are organized around the morning markets and the Buddhist temples and the agricultural cycle of the surrounding province, rather than around the preferences of foreign visitors. This is precisely why Greg liked it, and precisely why I found, within the first 2 weeks, that I liked it too. I met Tita in April, 3 weeks into the visit, at the weekend market near the train station that Greg had taken me to on my second Saturday. She was working at a stall selling handmade fakchi, herb bundles, and packaged dried spices, arranged with the kind of careful visual attention that I later learned was professionally deliberate. She had spent several years working as a wedding planner and event coordinator for traditional Thai ceremonies in the Udon Thani and Nong Khai area. And she understood presentation the way people understand it when their career depends on the impression things make rather than the things themselves. She was 26. I was 65. The arithmetic was visible to anyone looking, including me. Naturally, this did not stop anything. The thing about Taida, and I want to be fair here, in the way that I've had to work to be fair, because fairness is the only framework left when the other frameworks have all collapsed. The thing about Taida was that she was not unintelligent, and not simple, and not performing the obvious version of what I thought I was recognizing. She didn't flatter me about my age or my Western status in the ways I had been warned by Greg to watch for. She was direct and a little sharp, and she talked about her work in the wedding coordination business with a specificity that I found honestly refreshing. She understood the traditional Isan ceremony world in granular detail. She knew the protocols of the Khan Mak, the ceremonial procession of the groom's party to the bride's family, the structure of the Baisri Suquan blessing ceremony, the specific expectations around the Sin Sod display and the gold. She talked about this the way someone talks about a profession they've been in long enough to have opinions about. Looking back, of course she did. We had dinner 3 times before I flew back to Melbourne at the end of April. I extended my stay for 2 extra weeks. We had dinner 5 more times. She was interested in me as a person with a career and a history. Asked about the banking work with what seemed like genuine curiosity. Wanted to know about what financial services looked like in Australia, compared to what she knew about the Thai system. She had family in Ban Dung district, about 40 kilometers southeast of Udon Thani city, where her parents farmed rice and operated a small agricultural equipment business. She described her family with the matter-of-fact warmth of someone who is close to their people without sentimentalizing them. I found this appealing. Everything was precisely calibrated to be appealing to exactly the kind of man I was. I came back to Udon Thani in July 2022 and again in October. By the October visit, I had made the decision to relocate for at least a year and see how the Thailand life suited me. Greg, whose patience with my situation was considerable, helped me find a rental property near Nong Prajak that was comfortable without being extravagant. 15,000 baht per month, approximately AUD $620, for a 3-bedroom house with a garden and a covered car park. The comparison with Q made me briefly dizzy. The relationship with Taida had been developing over the 7 months across these 3 visits, in the way that long-distance relationships develop when the 2 people involved are communicating daily by phone and meeting in concentrated bursts that feel more significant for being limited. By October, the question of what the next step was had become the obvious conversation, and Taida raised it in the way that she raised most things, directly, without artificial drama, as a practical matter to be addressed. She said her family had expectations. She said, in the Isan tradition, a man who wanted to marry a woman from a respectable family was expected to demonstrate his respect and his capacity through the Sin Sod payment. She said this wasn't about money, it was about honor. She said she understood that for a Farang, foreigner, this was unfamiliar, and she would help me understand it fully. I want to tell you what she told me, because it was accurate in every important detail, which is the thing that made it so effective. She explained that Sin Sod in Isan was genuinely a statement of respect and intention, that the amount was determined by the family's standing in the community, the bride's education and background, and the groom's capacity to provide. She said it was traditional in many Isan families to display the payment in gold and cash at the ceremony, before returning all or part of it to the couple afterward, that the display was symbolic, and the return was a demonstration of the family's goodwill. She said her family was traditional and would expect a meaningful amount, but that her parents were reasonable people and the discussion would be respectful. She said she had helped coordinate dozens of these ceremonies for other couples and knew exactly how they worked. All of this was true. The Sin Sod system works exactly as she described it. The display and return practice exists, and is genuinely common in families with good intentions. What she did not say was that her family had no intention of returning anything, that the amount they were going to propose had been calibrated specifically to the maximum they believed a retired Australian banker would accept without balking, and that this calculation had been made before she ever approached the spice stall at the weekend market. In November 2022, Greg sat me down at his pool table and told me, with the careful directness of a man who has chosen his timing carefully, that he had been hearing things about Tida's family from his network of Thai friends in the Udon Thani area. He said he had heard that the family had a reputation in the Ban Dung district as aggressive negotiators in marriage discussions. He said he had heard from a Thai man he trusted, a former district officer named Kun Taksin, who was now practicing law in Udon Thani City, that there had been at least 2 previous cases involving Farang men and Tida's family, in which the Sin Sod discussions had gone further than the men had expected. He said he was not telling me not to proceed. He was telling me to go into the family discussions with Kun Taksin present, not just as a translator but as my formal representative. I thanked Greg. I told him I appreciated the concern. I said I had spent 35 years in financial services, and I understood how negotiation worked, and I would not be pushed into anything I wasn't comfortable with. Greg looked at me for a moment and then said, "The Sin Sod discussion isn't a negotiation, Edgar. It's a ceremony. That's why it's different." I heard this, and I did not fully process it. Naturally, the first Sin Sod discussion took place in December 2022 at the family home in Ban Dung district. Tida's father was a man in his late 50s who had the particular authority of a Puyai Ban village elder in his bearing. He had held that role in the Ban Dung community for several years, which I learned afterward explained a great deal about the dynamics of the ceremony. Her mother was quieter but managed the practical elements of the discussion with a precision that I now understand reflected significant experience. There were 3 uncles present, 2 of whom appeared to have formal roles in the discussion. There was a village elder from the neighboring household who served as a witness. And there was me, with Greg beside me and Kun Taksin at the end of the table, who had at least insisted on being present after I'd called him on Greg's recommendation. The figure they opened with was 5 million baht. At the December exchange rate, that was approximately AUD $210,000. Kun Taksin, to his considerable credit, negotiated firmly. He pointed out that while Tida's background and education were genuinely commendable, she had completed a hospitality management diploma in Khon Kaen. The display amount needed to reflect both the honor of the family and the practical reality of what a foreign retiree's resources could sustainably provide. The family accepted this framing with gracious flexibility, and the figure came down. After an hour of discussion that was conducted with the formal ritual precision of a traditional Isan negotiation, to 3.8 million baht. The ceremony day gold and cash display, 3.8 million baht, approximately AUD $158,000. With the expectation, as Tida had described, and as Kun Taksin confirmed was standard, that a significant portion would be returned to the couple after the ceremony. The amount returned after the ceremony, 0. Kun Taksin was informed, when he raised the question the following week, that the family had significant agricultural debts that had been settled using the Sin Sod funds, and that returning any portion was not possible at this time. He told me this with the restraint of a professional who has witnessed the same situation before, and who is managing his own frustration. I told him I was disappointed, but that I understood Thai family obligations, and that we would work something out over time. Naturally, we married in February 2023. The ceremony, and I want to say this plainly, because it is relevant to everything that follows, was genuinely one of the most beautiful things I have ever attended or participated in. I have been to weddings on 3 continents. I have attended the elaborate productions that wealthy Australians mount at wineries in the Yarra Valley, and the quiet registry office ceremonies of colleagues who didn't want a fuss. Nothing prepared me for the Isan traditional ceremony in the Ban Dung village at dawn in February. The Khan Mak, groom's procession, began at 5:30 in the morning, when it was still dark, and the temperature was the cool that the Isan dry season produces in its best moments. Not cold, just clean and fresh, the air smelling of the jasmine garlands that had been strung between the poles along the approach road, and the incense from the spirit houses at the property boundaries. The procession moved by lantern light toward the family compound, with the village men carrying the traditional golden trays of gifts, and the women in their most formal fa sin, the tube skirts in the deep red and gold weave patterns that are specific to the Udon Thani region. The Morlam, traditional Isan music, from a small ensemble near the compound gate, carried across the rice paddies in the pre-dawn quiet, in a way that I suspect I will hear clearly for the rest of my life when I choose to remember it. The Basri Su Kwan blessing ceremony that followed, conducted by monks from the local Wat, involved the tying of white cotton threads around the wrists of the couple by each family elder present, with a blessing spoken over each thread. I sat cross-legged on a woven mat with Tita beside me, and I received the threads and the blessings, and I thought, with a fullness of feeling that I am not going to minimize in retrospect, simply because what came after was what it was. This is extraordinary. I am 65 years old, and I am inside something extraordinary. I was inside something extraordinary. I was also inside something that had been constructed, at least in significant part, around what I would pay to be inside it. Both things were true. Of course they were. The architecture of the situation required both things to be true simultaneously, because neither worked without the other. The beauty was the delivery mechanism. The extraction was the purpose. The beauty was also real. The extraction was also real. Here is the thing that I have spent 14 months trying to reconcile, and that I think I have now reconciled, imperfectly but sufficiently. I am not going to pretend the first ceremony was nothing because of what followed. I paid AUD $158,000 for an experience that was genuine and meaningful, and unlike anything else I have had in 67 years. I also paid an additional AUD $122,000 for a second ceremony that did not exist in any traditional sense, and that existed only to extract the additional amount from a man who had demonstrated his willingness to pay. The first payment was for something real, at a price that was set by people who intended to keep the money rather than return it, which means the transaction was not what it appeared to be, even when the experience it produced was genuine. I know how to hold those two things. It took a while. The amount returned after the first ceremony, 0, where Tida demonstrated the organizational skills of someone who has spent years planning other people's perfect trips, and who can apply those skills to her own purposes with impressive efficiency. I paid for everything. This was not a source of tension. I had the money and she did not, and the allocation of expenses followed naturally from that. What I noticed, without registering the pattern clearly, was that the amounts she spent were consistently in the upper range of what was plausible. Not extravagant, not outrageous, but always, consistently, at the expensive end of each category of decision. The restaurant, the excursion, the spa treatment. Always the better option. She never asked. She simply selected, and I paid, and we moved on. By April 2023, we were living together in the Nong Prajak house. Tita managed the household with the same organizational competence she applied to everything, and the household hummed in the way that a well-managed operation hums. Her family visited frequently. This was consistent with Isan family culture, which I understood from Greg and from Kun Taksin and from the reading I had done. In Isan, the family unit extends well beyond the nuclear household, and regular family involvement in a couple's life is normal and expected. What I was slower to notice was that the family visits correlated, with a consistency that should have been statistically obvious, with requests for money. The requests were always framed in the same way, not as asks, but as discussions of situations. The father needed parts for the agricultural equipment that had broken down in the middle of the rice harvest. 85,000 baht. An uncle's motorbike taxi had been in an accident and he needed medical costs covered and a replacement vehicle. 120,000 baht. A cousin was getting married, and the family needed to contribute a respectable Sin Sod. There was an irony in this that I recognized but did not fully excavate. 60,000 baht. Each request was accompanied by the specific detail that makes a story credible. The name of the hospital, the model of the motorbike, the date of the cousin's ceremony. Each request was presented not to me but to Tita, who then discussed it with me with the slightly uncomfortable manner of someone who knows they're asking for something but feels obligated to family. I was, each time, the person who resolved the discomfort by agreeing. The total of these family contributions across the 8 months between February and September 2023, approximately 780,000 baht, or AUD $32,000, filed, in my mental accounting, under the general category of Thai family life, as the cost of being embedded in a real family, in a real community, rather than floating above it as a tourist. I want to be clear about something that I think is important, and that I do not hear discussed enough in accounts like this. The family was not simply inventing needs. The agricultural equipment did break down. I saw the photograph of the broken part. I saw the receipt when the repair was done. The uncle did have a motorbike accident. I saw the hospital discharge papers, translated by Tata into perfectly accurate English. The cousin's ceremony was real. What was constructed was not the need, but the routing. The money that went to the family for these purposes came from me. Whether that money was then used specifically for those purposes, or whether it freed up family funds that were used for something else, is a question I cannot answer, and am not going to pretend I can. What I know is that the pattern of need presentation and payment became, over 8 months, a mechanism so normalized that I had stopped noticing it as a pattern at all. It was simply the texture of our family life. In June 2023, Tita mentioned that her father had spoken to her about a second ceremony. She was casual about it. It came up in the middle of a conversation about the upcoming rice festival in the province. Not as a formal announcement, but as something mentioned in passing. She said her father had raised it at a family dinner the previous week, and that she had said she would talk to me about it when the time seemed right. She said she wasn't pushing for anything. She just wanted me to know it had been discussed. I filed this away. I did not ask Kun Taksin about it. I did not ask Greg about it. I mentioned it once, in August, to Greg, in the course of a broader conversation about the Isan ceremony world, and Greg said, "I've not heard of a second Sin Sod ceremony." I said it sounded like a more community-level celebration, different from the formal ceremony. Greg said, "Maybe." He said it in the way that men say maybe when they mean something stronger, but have decided not to push. I heard the maybe and moved on. And then, in September 2023, Tida told me the family wanted to proceed with the second ceremony, and I said yes. Of course I did. She explained this carefully, and the explanation was, as all her explanations were, completely accurate and internally consistent. She said that the February ceremony had been the formal civil and religious marriage, but that in some traditional Isan families, there was also a separate traditional ceremony, a more village-level community celebration, that was distinct from the formal wedding, and that had its own protocols and its own associated costs. She said her father had mentioned it in June, and she had been waiting for the right moment to raise it. She said it was important to her family, and to the village community, and to her own sense of having done this properly. She said she completely understood if I felt it was too much, and that she would accept whatever I decided. I did not feel it was too much. Of course I didn't. I had just spent 8 months successfully managing my role as the husband of a Thai woman from a traditional Isan family, and I had, I believed, developed a reasonable understanding of how these obligations worked. The second ceremony was the cost of doing this properly, of not being a Farang who took the relationship without fully committing to its cultural context. The second Sin Sod discussion took place in October 2023, at the same family home in Ban Dung. The same structure, the father, the mother, the uncles, the village elder witness. Kun Taksin was not present this time, because I had not called him, because I felt I had understood the process from the first time, and did not need a formal representative for what I had been told was a less formal community ceremony. This was, as Kun Taksin told me 3 weeks later when I described the situation, the specific error that made everything else possible. The figure for the second ceremony, 2.9 million baht, approximately AUD $122,000. After discussion, which I participated in myself without professional representation, it came down to 2.9 million baht. I did not successfully negotiate a reduction. I told myself this was because the context was less formal, and the family's flexibility was therefore different. What it was, in fact, was that without Kun Taksin, there was no one in the room whose interests were aligned with mine, and the discussion proceeded entirely on terms set by the family. I transferred the money in 3 installments across October and November. I then asked about the return of the display funds. Tita said she would discuss it with her father. She discussed it with her father. Her father said the village community events associated with the ceremony had cost more than expected, and the family would need additional time. Tita relayed this with the practiced empathy of someone who is managing two conversations simultaneously, the one with her husband and the one with her family, and who has learned exactly how to translate between them in a way that keeps both in motion without triggering a confrontation. I said I understood. In December 2023, I went to visit Greg, which I had been doing less frequently since the marriage. Greg poured 2 beers and sat across from me in his garden and asked, in the careful way of a man who suspects something but wants to be wrong, how the second ceremony had gone. I told him the basic shape of it. Greg was quiet. Then he said, Edgar, the second ceremony. Did Tita present this as something her family suggested after the first wedding? I said yes. Greg said, the second ceremony isn't a traditional practice in Isan. I've lived here for 7 years. I've attended more traditional ceremonies than I can count. There isn't a second Sin Sod ceremony. There's one. I stared at Greg for a long time. Then I called Thaksin. I want to describe the space between Greg's sentence and my phone call to Thaksin, because it contains something important that I have not managed to say accurately in the various conversations I have had about this situation since returning to Melbourne. It was not disbelief. I am a banker. I understand, at a professional level, how fraud works. And the moment Greg said those words, I understood, with the same clean analytical clarity I had applied to risk assessments across 35 years of corporate banking, that I had been defrauded. There was no disbelief. There was also no rage, not at that moment. Rage came later, in the taxi on the way back to the Nong Prajak house, in the specific form of a sustained internal monologue about my own competence, that I do not need to reproduce here, but that was thorough and not flattering. What there was in the garden, in the space between Greg's sentence and the phone call, was something I can only describe as the specific humiliation of a professional expert who has been successfully taken in their own area of supposed expertise. I had spent 35 years identifying and managing financial risk. The Sin Sod was a financial instrument, and I had walked into the second payment without verification, without representation, without any of the standard protective mechanisms I would have required as a minimum before approving a corporate transaction of a tenth that size. Thaksin came to the Nong Prajak house that afternoon. He sat at the kitchen table while I made tea I did not serve, because I forgot about it partway through the process. And he went through what he had been hearing from his contacts in Ban Dung and the broader Udon Thani district for the past 12 months. Because he had, as it turned out, been hearing things, and had been watching to see whether I would come to him or whether he would need to find a way to raise it. He had found a way to raise it twice, once obliquely through Greg in November, once more directly in a conversation with me in August when he had asked, apparently casually, whether the family had raised any new ceremonial obligations. I had told him they hadn't, because at that point Tita had only mentioned it once, and I had classified it as preliminary discussion rather than a formal proposal. Thaksin nodded when I said this. He had been trying to get ahead of the second ceremony, and had arrived too late. What Thaksin told me over the following 2 weeks, as he made inquiries through his network of contacts in the Udon Thani legal and community world, was this. The family in Ban Dung had been involved in at least 2 previous situations involving Farang men and Sin Sod payments, both within the preceding 6 years. In both cases, a large payment had been made, and the ceremonially promised return had not been fulfilled. In neither case had the Farang man pursued legal action, for the obvious reasons. The amounts, while significant, were not worth the cost and complexity of Thai civil litigation from overseas, and the emotional investment in the relationship made formal legal action feel like an act of self-destruction on top of the financial one. The family knew this. The family had, in Thaksin's assessment, structured the scheme around this knowledge. The second ceremony was not a traditional Isan practice. It was a specific invention of the families, presented to Farang men who had already paid the first Sin Sod, and who were therefore sufficiently committed to the relationship and to the cultural framework to accept that a second obligation existed without independently verifying whether it did. He also told me, which was the detail that landed with the specific cold clarity of information you have been half expecting and hoping not to hear, that Tita had worked as a wedding ceremony coordinator for precisely these reasons. Not only because she understood the ceremonial world, but because the ceremonial world gave her access to Farang men at the precise moment of maximum emotional investment and minimum analytical caution, and because her professional role gave her genuine credentials and legitimate ceremonial knowledge that made the presentation of any ceremony-related request appear entirely credible. She had not stumbled into this. She had built the apparatus of it professionally. I confronted Tita that evening. She did not deny what Kun Taksin had found. She said her family had debts and had used the resources available to them to address those debts. She said she was sorry for any misunderstanding about the second ceremony's traditional status. She said the feeling between us was real. She said, "I did care for you, but my family needed me to do this." She said it with a directness that I found, in that moment, almost admirably clear. The feeling was real. The scheme was also real. Both things coexisted in the same woman, and the existence of the first did not cancel the existence of the second. I asked her why she had gone through with it. She said, "Because you would have paid it, and you did." She was right. She was completely right, and I had no answer to the accuracy of it. The financial accounting I did at the kitchen table in the Nong Prajak house the following morning, with a legal pad and a calculator, and the coffee I had made before sitting down and not started drinking. First Sin Sod, AUD $158,000. Second Sin Sod, AUD $122,000. Family assistance contributions across the year, AUD $32,000. Honeymoon, AUD $8,400. House running costs, flights, living expenses for the year in Udon Thani, AUD $24,000. Total, AUD $344,400 spent in Thailand across 21 months. Of that, the amounts I consider irrecoverable due to the fraudulent nature of the second ceremony and the non-return of the first, AUD $280,000. The balance represents genuine living costs and genuine cultural contributions to a family network I was genuinely part of. However, that family was also using me. I left Udon Thani in January 2024. I packed 2 bags, which was everything I had brought with me. The house on Nong Prajak was rented, so there was nothing to close down beyond the utilities and the landlord notification. I drove to the airport in a taxi I booked through the hotel app rather than asking Tita to organize, because some habits of independence had returned faster than others. At Udon Thani International Airport, I bought a bottle of water and sat in the departure lounge for 2 hours and looked at the small domestic terminal and the people moving through it, the monks in saffron robes and the families with their overstacked luggage, and the agricultural workers from the surrounding provinces catching flights to Bangkok. And I thought about what Greg had said at the pool table in November. The Sin Sod discussion isn't a negotiation, it's a ceremony. He was right. That was the thing I had failed to understand. I had treated a ritual as a transaction, and in doing so, I had miscalculated the leverage I had, which, in a transaction context, comes from the ability to walk away, and in a ceremony context, comes from the fact that you've already emotionally committed to the outcome, and walking away has a cost the other party understands, and is counting on you not being willing to pay. Here's what I actually know, after 35 years in banking and 21 months in Udon Thani. The Sin Sod system is real and is genuinely important in Thai culture, particularly in Isan, and it is not inherently exploitative. Most families that participate in it are doing so in good faith, with real traditions and real expectations of return. The existence of a legitimate cultural practice is not the same as every instance of that practice being legitimate. Anyone who dismisses the Sin Sod as inherently problematic is wrong. Anyone who accepts any Sin Sod arrangement uncritically, because the cultural framework appears genuine, is vulnerable to exactly what happened to me. These two things are both true simultaneously, and neither one cancels the other. There is no second Sin Sod ceremony in traditional Isan practice. If you are presented with one, it does not exist. Whatever it is being called, whatever rationale is provided, whatever emotional pressure accompanies the request, there is no second Sin Sod. Verify this independently, from sources outside the family, before you engage with the question at any level. The independent verification takes one phone call to a bilingual lawyer, or one conversation with a long-term Thai expat who knows the ceremonial traditions of the region. It costs nothing. It would have saved me AUD $122,000. I did not make the phone call because I had already decided I understood the situation. This is what professional confidence produces when it operates without a counterweight of genuine local knowledge. A bilingual Thai lawyer who is your representative, not a family advisor, not a family friend, not anyone connected to the other side of the negotiation, needs to be present at every Sin Sod discussion, regardless of how informal the family presents the context as being. The informality of the context is frequently the specific feature of the design. The first time I had Kun Taksin present, the opening figure of 5 million baht came down to 3.8 million. The second time I did not bring him. The figure they proposed was the figure I paid. The differential between those two outcomes is the cost of independent professional representation, and that cost is dramatically lower than the differential suggests. Kun Taksin's day rate in Udon Thani is 8,000 baht. Do the arithmetic. I also want to say something about the cultural sensitivity argument, because it was the specific argument I used against myself throughout this process. I told myself that treating the Sin Sod discussion with the same analytical skepticism I would apply to a corporate transaction was culturally disrespectful. That to bring lawyers and demand documentation and verify traditions independently was to approach a ceremony of genuine cultural weight, as though it were a business deal, and that this approach would be both insulting to the family and contrary to the spirit of what the ceremony was supposed to mean. This argument is wrong. The Sin Sod is a real cultural tradition. Real cultural traditions can be exploited by people who understand them well enough to use them as cover for extraction schemes. Respecting a tradition means understanding it accurately, not accepting every claim made in its name without verification. Cultural sensitivity and critical verification are not mutually exclusive. Anyone who tells you they are, who tells you that asking questions is disrespectful, that bringing a lawyer is an insult, that seeking independent confirmation is a failure of trust, is telling you something that benefits them rather than you. The thing that banking experience does not prepare you for is a context where the emotional investment in the relationship precedes the financial commitment and provides the leverage for it. In corporate banking, the money comes before the relationship trust. In marriage, the trust comes first. The people who understand this, who have built a scheme around this specific sequencing, have a structural advantage that your professional experience does not address and may actively work against, because your confidence in reading financial situations makes you less likely to seek the independent verification that the situation requires. If you are a person with significant professional experience in finance, or law, or deal evaluation of any kind, and someone is telling you that your professional instincts are sufficient protection in an unfamiliar cultural and legal context, they are telling you something that is flattering and false. The instincts work in the framework they were built in. Outside that framework, they are overconfidence without content. I know this now. It took AUD $280,000 to learn it, which I consider genuinely embarrassing for a man of my professional background, and which I am telling you in the hope that you find a cheaper way. I'm 67 years old. I'm in Melbourne. The AUD $625,000 I came to Thailand with is now approximately AUD $280,000, and the pension is sufficient to live comfortably at the scale I've recalibrated to, which is the scale of a man who has learned something expensive. Nathan was generous in his response to what happened, which I did not expect, and which meant more than I said to him at the time. Tita, from what Greg has told me, is still in Udon Thani. The family is still in Ban Dung. The agricultural equipment business continues to operate. The village elder still witnesses ceremonies. Of course, I spent 35 years in banking believing that expertise was transferable, and that confidence was a form of protection. Turns out expertise is domain-specific, and confidence is a liability in unfamiliar territory. I know this now. It cost AUD $280,000 to know it, which I consider, and I say this with the particular dark humor of a man who has had 14 months to work towards something like equanimity, a very inefficient method of acquiring knowledge that was freely available If I had only been willing to seek it before I needed it. At least the first ceremony was beautiful. I'm keeping that. They can't have it back. One more thing I want to say, directed at the man who is reading this from a position similar to where I was in November 2022, who has heard something that should concern him, who has had the conversation with the Greg in his life, and who has decided that his own experience and judgment are sufficient to navigate whatever comes next. They are not sufficient. I was a corporate relationship banker for 35 years. I managed accounts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I assessed risk for a living. None of that protected me from paying AUD $280,000 across 2 Sin Sod payments to a family that had designed this outcome before Tita and I ever had our first conversation. Not because I am stupid. I am not stupid. But because the expertise and the confidence I had built across 3.5 decades were built for a specific kind of environment. And the Isan traditional ceremony world is not that environment. What protected me, imperfectly and only partially, was having Kun Taksin present for the first ceremony. What failed to protect me at all was leaving Kun Taksin out of the second. That is the whole lesson. The rest is detail. Get your own independent advisor. Keep them present for every financial discussion that involves the family. Never let the emotional weight of a ceremony, however beautiful and however genuine its beauty, prevent you from verifying what the ceremony's obligations actually require. The first ceremony was beautiful. I was there. I know. Go verify anyway. And if someone presents you with a second ceremony, there isn't one. There is only one. Walk away from the second one, no matter what they call it, and no matter what it costs you emotionally to refuse. The price of refusal is a difficult conversation. The price of compliance is what I paid. The arithmetic is simple.